The first Christmas my father forgot me, I was 9 years old, sitting by the window of my grandmother's apartment in a good wool sweater my mother had ironed for the occasion, watching the street below for a car that never came. He'd promised to pick me up at 10, take me to breakfast the way he did every year before the divorce settled into its permanent, familiar shape, a tradition that had survived the separation itself, at least for the first couple of years, a small, consistent thread that made the whole rearranged family feel, briefly, survivable. I remember the specific quality of light that morning, gray and flat through my grandmother's lace curtains, and the sound of the radiator ticking in the corner, and how I kept checking the clock on her kitchen wall, certain each time that surely more time hadn't actually passed than it felt like. 10 o'clock came and went. Then 11. My grandmother made me a second breakfast around noon, scrambled eggs I didn't really want, and I ate them anyway because refusing felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit yet. By 1, she'd started making small, distracted phone calls in the other room, her voice pitched low in a way that, even at 9, I understood was meant to keep something from me. I sat there in my good sweater until almost 2 in the afternoon before she finally came and sat down beside me on the window seat, put her arm around my shoulders and said, gently, that maybe he'd gotten confused about the day. Maybe there'd been some mix-up with the dates. I believed her, at 9. I wanted to, badly, the way you want to believe almost anything that keeps the floor from opening up underneath you. By the time I was 14, I'd stopped believing it was confusion, because confusion doesn't happen 5 years running with such reliable, almost mechanical precision. There was a pattern to it by then, unmistakable even to a kid still working out the basic shape of how disappointment worked. The calls that came a week late with some loose explanation about work emergencies or a new girlfriend's family obligations or car trouble on the highway. The gifts that either never arrived at all or arrived so far off season they felt almost like an insult dressed up as an afterthought. A video game system that showed up in March, long after I'd moved on to wanting something else entirely. A winter coat that arrived in June, still in its shipping box, tags on, never worn because by the time it came the season it was meant for had already passed twice over. My mother never badmouthed him in front of me, to her enormous credit, something I only fully appreciated once I was old enough to understand how much restraint that must have required. She just quietly absorbed the disappointment on my behalf, year after year, without ever making a show of it, made sure our own Christmas morning together was warm enough, full enough, that his absence had somewhere soft to land instead of just an empty space where a father should have been. She'd wake me early, make the cinnamon rolls from the recipe her own mother used, let me open one gift before breakfast the way we always had, and for a few hours each year it almost worked, almost filled in the shape of what was missing. But I noticed. Kids always notice, even the ones adults think are too young or too distracted to catch what's happening around them. I noticed the careful way she'd change the subject if I asked when Dad was coming. I noticed the particular tightness in her jaw whenever his name came up in conversation with relatives. And somewhere around 16, I made a decision, consciously, deliberately, the way you decide to stop touching a stove that keeps burning you no matter how many times you're told this time will be different. I stopped expecting him to show up at all for Christmas or anything else, which hurt less, I told myself at the time, than hoping. He wasn't a bad man in any dramatic, easily narrated sense, nothing you could point to as outright cruelty or the kind of story that makes people gasp when you tell it. He never raised his voice at me, never said anything actively hurtful that I could quote back later as evidence. He was just fundamentally, consistently unreliable in the exact places where reliability mattered most, a man built entirely out of good intentions that somehow never survived contact with follow-through. He'd call in February sometimes, out of nowhere, warm and affectionate on the phone, tell me he loved me, ask genuine, detailed questions about school and friends and whatever I was into that year, and I'd let myself soften toward him for a few weeks each time, let some small, stubborn part of me start hoping again despite everything I'd already learned, before the pattern reasserted itself right on schedule, and I remembered, all over again, exactly why I'd built the wall in the first place. My mother used to say, on the rare occasions she'd allow herself even a small comment about him, that he loved me the way some people love the ocean, from a comfortable distance, admiring it from the shore, telling anyone who'd listen how much he loved it, without ever actually getting in the water, without ever risking the cold or the current or the vulnerability of actually being submerged in something real. I built my adult life largely without him, brick by brick, in the specific spaces his absence had carved out over the years. I put myself through college mostly on loans and a work-study job shelving returns in the university library, a job I actually came to love in a strange way, the quiet predictability of it, the sense that if I put a book back correctly it would stay exactly where I left it. I started a small software consultancy in my late 20s with 2 friends from a coding boot camp I'd taken on nights and weekends while working a day job I hated. The 3 of us running the whole operation out of a rented office above a dry cleaner for the first 2 years. Worked 80-hour weeks for a long stretch that mostly blurred together in memory now, chasing something I couldn't fully name even to myself at the time, though a therapist I saw briefly in my 30s during a rough patch after a relationship ended, suggested, not unkindly, that some meaningful portion of that drive might have been about proving something to a man who'd never once shown up to see the proof, who wouldn't have known how to properly witness it even if he had. The company grew slowly for years, incrementally, the kind of growth that felt more like survival than success most days, and then, in one dizzying 18-month stretch that still feels somewhat unreal when I try to reconstruct it, very quickly culminating in an acquisition by a larger firm, a deal that changed the entire shape of my financial life overnight in a way I genuinely hadn't prepared myself for emotionally, no matter how many spreadsheets I'd built anticipating the numbers. I remember sitting in the lawyer's office the day the paperwork finalized, staring at a wire transfer confirmation on my laptop screen, a number that still didn't feel entirely real to me even weeks later, even after I'd watched it sit in my account and hadn't touched most of it, too stunned by the scale of it to know what to do besides let it exist there quietly while I figured out who I was now. On the other side of all those years of 80-hour weeks, I bought the house 8 months after that closed, a 6-bedroom place on 4 acres outside Charlotte. More space than I needed for one person living alone if I was being fully honest with myself standing in the empty rooms during the final walkthrough, but something in me had wanted it anyway, had wanted it specifically, the pool out back, the wraparound porch that caught the evening light just right, the kind of house that photographed like an announcement rather than simply a place to live, the kind of house you couldn't drive past without noticing. I don't think I fully understood in the moment I signed the closing documents what exactly I was announcing or who, deep down, some small and still 9-year-old part of me had actually built it for. My father found out about it the way he found out about most things in my life by then, secondhand, through my cousin's Facebook post congratulating me, tagged with a photo of the front entrance, the wraparound porch catching the late afternoon light in a way that made the whole house look almost staged, unreal, like something out of a magazine spread rather than a place I actually lived. He called me within the week, his voice warm in a way I hadn't heard directed at me in years. Maybe over a decade if I really counted back, full of a pride that felt, even as I listened to it, oddly weightless and unearned, like praise from someone who'd shown up for the finale without ever having watched any of the show that led there, who didn't know the names of the characters or the shape of the plot but wanted credit anyway for the ending. "I always knew you had it in you," he said, and I could hear him practically beaming through the phone, could picture the exact expression he probably had on, the one I remembered from childhood on the rare occasions he was genuinely pleased about something. "You get that drive from me, you know. I always told your mother you were going to do something big." I didn't correct him. I didn't have the energy that particular evening, standing in my new kitchen with the granite countertops still smelling faintly of sealant, to explain that whatever drive I had, I'd built alone, brick by exhausting brick, in the exact spaces his absence had carved out over 3 decades, that the closest thing to inheritance I'd gotten from him was the specific, motivating ache of wanting to become someone who couldn't be so easily overlooked. I just said thank you and got off the phone as quickly as I politely could manage, unsettled by how easily, how naturally, he'd inserted himself into a story he'd had almost no part in writing, as though narrating himself into significance was a reflex he'd never had to unlearn. He called more after that, considerably more than he had in the previous decade combined, a sudden and disorienting reversal of a lifetime pattern, always with some excuse to bring the conversation back around to the house, asking about square footage in a tone that suggested genuine architectural curiosity rather than anything more calculated, asking whether I needed help managing the property, whether 4 acres wasn't an awful lot for one person to keep up with alone, mentioning with increasing and increasingly specific frequency, how nice it would be to spend real time together now that I finally had room for family, a phrase he used more than once, always slightly different, always landing on the same emphasis. I told myself, for a while, sitting through these calls on my new porch some evenings with a glass of wine, watching the sun go down over 4 acres I still sometimes couldn't quite believe were mine, that this was simply what it looked like when an absent parent tried, late and imperfectly, clumsily, to reconnect with a child he'd let slip through his fingers for years. Some small, still hopeful part of me, the part that had once sat by a window in a Goodwill sweater waiting for a car that never came, wanted badly, embarrassingly badly for a grown woman with a company sale behind her, to believe that this was real, that success had somehow finally made me visible to him in a way childhood never had. It took a phone call from my father's second wife, Denise, awkward and hesitant in a way that immediately told me something was different about this conversation before she'd said more than a few sentences, to show me exactly what those calls had actually been building toward. "I probably shouldn't be telling you this," she said, her voice low, like she was speaking from somewhere she didn't want overheard, maybe a bathroom or a parked car. "But I don't feel right staying quiet about it either. Your father's been talking to a lawyer about the house." I sat down slowly on the edge of my bed, phone pressed hard against my ear, the room around me suddenly feeling very still. "What lawyer? What about the house?" "He's been telling people, his brother, some old friends from the plant, even my sister, that he's owed something. That he's your father and family helps family, and that a place that big, you'd barely notice giving him a piece of it. He's been talking about getting his name added to the deed or getting some kind of settlement if you won't do that. He mentioned something about how he supported you financially as a kid, how he's owed for all the birthdays and holidays that add up over the years." She paused, and I could hear her take a breath, steadying herself for what came next. "He's been rehearsing an argument, if that makes sense. I've heard him practice it in the bathroom mirror, if you can believe that. About how he was always there for you in spirit even when he couldn't be there physically, about how a father's love doesn't need to show up to count." I sat there on the edge of my bed for a long moment after she finished, staring at the far wall of a bedroom in a house he'd never once helped pay for, never once contributed a single dollar toward, a house built entirely on 80-hour weeks he hadn't witnessed and hadn't asked about at the time they were actually happening, when they might have meant something to hear about, when I might have actually needed him to ask. "He supported me financially as a kid?" I repeated slowly, testing the phrase, feeling how absurd it sounded out loud. "Denise, he was 6 months behind on child support more years than he wasn't. My mother has the records. I've seen them." "I know," she said quietly. "I've seen some of them too, actually, going through old boxes once. I didn't want you walking into whatever this turns into unprepared. He can be very convincing when he's decided on a version of events. I've watched him do it before, with other people, other situations. He believes it while he's saying it, that's the thing. I don't think he's lying, exactly. I think he's just rewritten it somewhere along the way, and he believes the new version completely." I thanked her, meant it, told her I knew this couldn't have been an easy call to make, and got off the phone feeling something settle in my chest that was almost, strangely, relief. Not because the news itself was good, it clearly wasn't, but because the uncertainty I'd been quietly carrying for months, the small, hopeful voice wondering if maybe this time was different, finally had an answer, definitive and clear, even if it wasn't the one I'd wanted. He called 2 weeks later, and this time I let the conversation go exactly where he wanted to steer it, curious now, watching for the shape of the argument Denise had described. "I've been thinking," he said, after the usual few minutes of surface pleasantries, "that we should talk about the future, about the house, specifically. I'm not getting any younger, and Denise and I are in a tight spot with our place, and I thought you've got all this room out there, and family should look out for family. Maybe we talk to a lawyer, figure out something formal, get my name on the deed as a joint owner. It would give me some security, and honestly, it's the kind of thing a good daughter does for her father in his later years." I let the silence sit for a moment before I answered, giving myself time to make sure my voice would come out steady rather than sharp. "Dad, I need to ask you something honestly. In the 14 years between my 9th Christmas and my 18th birthday, how many holidays did you actually show up for?" He hesitated, clearly not expecting the question to go there. That's not really relevant to what I'm talking about. It's entirely relevant, I said. Because you're describing a version of yourself who was there for me, who supported me, who's owed something now because of years of presence that I don't actually remember experiencing. I remember a lot of empty driveways, Dad. I remember gifts that showed up in the wrong season, if they showed up at all. I remember a mother who worked 2 jobs and never once complained to me about where the child support checks were, even though I found out as an adult exactly how often they weren't there. That was a long time ago, he said, his voice shifting now, defensive.
People change.
I've tried to make an effort recently, haven't I? I've been calling more. You've been calling more since I bought this house, I said. Not before. I noticed the timing, Dad. I don't think you did it consciously, maybe, I don't know, but I noticed. There was a long silence on his end, long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. So that's a no. On the house. That's a no, I confirmed. Not because I don't want a relationship with you. I think some part of me still does, even now, even after this conversation. But that relationship can't start with you being handed something you didn't help build, based on a version of the past that isn't true. If you want to actually be my father, at this point in both our lives, it's going to have to look like something real. Showing up.
Consistently.
Without an agenda attached to my address. He didn't have much to say after that, and the call ended shortly afterward, shorter and colder than it had started. He didn't call again for several months, and when he finally did, near the following Christmas, it was a short, ordinary call. No mention of the house, no mention of lawyers or deeds, just a somewhat stilted conversation about the weather and my cousin's new baby that ended with an "I love you" I chose, for reasons I'm still working out even now, to believe. I don't know yet what our relationship will become from here, whether that phone call was a genuine turning point or just another temporary lull before some new version of the old pattern reasserts itself. But I know I own this house free and clear, every beam and window of it earned through years he wasn't present for, and I know now, in a way I didn't fully understand as a girl sitting by a window in a Goodwill sweater, that showing up late for the finale doesn't entitle anyone to a seat at the table they never helped set.